traveling, all his main activities, my first reaction was, does this man sleep? And then I realized, yes, because I met him yesterday, and he is one of the most energetic and positive persons I have ever met in my life. Secondly, and it's because it's always the details that make the difference. One of the things that Paul does, and has nothing to do with oceans, he's one of the ambassadors of Driven to Extremes charity, which deals with soldiers, ex-soldiers that are injured and suffering from PTSD and need specialized treatment on their road to recovery. It's not all about doctors, hospitals, or medication, and PTSD has a huge impact on soldiers and their families and society. So that, for me, was like the cherry on top of the cake. Now, what I would like, lastly, to emphasize is Paul's willingness to be here with us. He arrived yesterday from Manchester, and he has to leave here at 12:30 to catch a plane back to Manchester and then to South Korea.
Yes.
So as you can see, he is really very willingly to be here with us. So we now have a chance to enjoy his expertise. And so with all of this, Paul, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you very much. Well, thank you, Raquel. Thank you, Tiago. And thanks to all of you. And it is good to be here. And I've often wondered why I feel so at home in Lisbon and in Portugal. I never could work it out, but I've been here many times as a sailor and as a diver, and of course as a tourist. And then luckily, last year I took a test at National Geographic. They have these very complex, high-level DNA tests. And then they can take your DNA and send it off to all these laboratories. So it's slightly worrying that my DNA is hanging around in all these laboratories. Never know what's going to... And then they send you this report, a very detailed report as to where you come from. And I flicked through all of the first pages because it's quite technical. And I wanted to see the map. And me and my ancestors, when we left Africa, Eritrea, we went up north, and some people, as you know, go north over to Scandinavia, which I thought maybe that was me because I love the cold places. And then there's a big group that goes around into Asia, and then my arrow comes around into Europe and lands in Portugal. I could barely believe it. So I was very happy. So, I can hardly claim I'm Portuguese, but there is a reason I'm very happy to be home here. And the other thing that we won't talk too much about is that in the deep analysis, my partner laughed and noticed and was almost rolling around the floor with laughter when she discovered that I have an extraordinarily high amount of Neanderthal man in me. Bigger than they've ever recorded, so I'm going to go back to do more tests, but it counts for the long arms and the sore knuckles on the ground. But so I'm Paul Rose, and I'm trying to be Portuguese, or at least Azorian, partly because the last expedition that I led with Emmanuel and the team was to the Azores. I lead something called the Pristine Seas expeditions from National Geographic. We've had 22 expeditions, been able to help create 17 marine protected areas, which add up to over 5.5 million square kilometres of protection. And this all came about because of a genius called Dr. Enrique Sala, who's a dear friend of mine. He was a professor at Scripps in California, one of these young professors. How can you be a professor at 34? But he was. And every science paper he did, every lesson he taught, every step in his academic career, he thought, one day said, you know what? I'm writing the obituary of the ocean. He didn't feel that this greater knowledge, this greater awareness raising, this greater sense of understanding would ever get to protect the ocean. He was just writing the obituary. So at that time, he wasn't part of National Geographic, so I went to National Geographic, explained this, and started something called Pristine Seas with the idea that he put a team together to go to the last wild places in the ocean. Why not protect them? There's all this awareness raising going on. There's all these science studies going on. There's all of these political battles that were beginning to form at that time. But why not somehow cut through all of that with a laser focus to protect the last wild pristine places in the ocean, a bit like putting money in the bank, as we call it. You know, we put the ocean under a lot of stress, and if we keep removing stuff from the ocean and putting it under stress, something's going to happen, so let's put money in the bank is how we word it. So he started Pristine Seas. It's a beautiful project because it's one of the only projects I know that has the ability and the resources and the will to do all of the political work and reconnaissance work and understanding a long time before the expedition takes place. So many field science projects go, and you know, who doesn't love that enthusiasm of just going on an expedition? We all love that, right? You know, I'm going to study butterflies in Mozambique because I love butterflies and I've got some Mozambican contacts and I'm off, you know. And then 20 years later, that person is still struggling to try and make a political difference. Whereas we, with Enric's leadership and the resources of National Geographic, we really put a lot of effort into all of the political analysis, where the movers and influences might be, where the nudges might occur, and what changes need to happen well before we even go somewhere. And that includes sending people to these places. So then when we go, we know, you know, something is likely to happen. Now, these expeditions are all over the place, you know, from Antarctica to the Russian Arctic to all the warm places in between. And a great example is the Azores expedition this year. It came because, very fortunately, in the Salvagens, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, to do the Salvagens, I led that expedition, and a name appeared on my email, Emmanuel Gonzalez, and he was our local man, expert. So we worked together for 5 minutes and discovered that we're going to do a lot more. And we had a great expedition in the Salvagens, and then this led to the Azores. So we didn't have to do much on our side from National Geographic to make the Azores happen, except, you know, it really opened my eyes that we have to use the term, there really is Hawaii in Europe. Mm-hmm. You know, it really does exist. And you know, what next? Well, we've done the science, we've made the film, we've made all the contacts, we've told everybody all about it, and now it sits with the political process and the diplomatic leadership and business leadership to actually get the Azores signed in as a large-scale, global leading marine protected area. And on the surface of it, it couldn't be simpler, because I've never seen such an, opportunistic an opportunity with the ocean right now. It's a hugely optimistic time. I mean, who would have thought we'd see the day where you've got the UK government have an official Twitter account, and it's called UK Blue Belt, and they pop up on my Twitter every day with news about the UK waters and the UK overseas territories. And yesterday they announced, the UK government, that they're going to protect 30% of our waters by 2030. And that, to me, feels like global leadership. And yet, my colleagues in government would admit that 5 years ago they never would have foreseen that on Twitter you would be announcing big commitments. And these are global leading commitments. And all of us here, you know, we do attend these big international ocean conferences. And in the past years, it's almost become a competition where global leaders will stand and say, we are going to protect 10% of this, or we have established this MPA of this size, and someone else, well, we have established that. And that sense of healthy competition exists about the ocean. Who would have thought it? I mean, when I started diving in 1969, I was energized by the fact that we didn't know anything about the ocean. I loved the thought that it was the largest, least protected, least understood ecosystem on the planet, and I was a little speck swimming around in it. That was exciting for me. But now I'm excited that as we begin to understand it, we realize that we have affected it negatively, and there's a time for action right now. We really are at a tipping point, but we've got the tools to do it. We couldn't have had these commitments for large-scale marine protected areas if we didn't have satellite surveillance. No one has money for a fleet of fisheries patrol vessels, you know, boots on decks, as we call it, people driving around the ocean who can only see 3 or 4 miles away and on the radar chasing fast, professional, illegal fishing. But now we have satellite surveillance, and it works. I've seen it work, and it's not difficult for wealthy countries to have satellite surveillance, and it's also quite simple for developing countries or countries that don't quite have the money for the surveillance to be supported by others and big NGOs to get satellite surveillance. So this really works. We really can see what's going on. And then, only recently, we had something called the Port State Measures agreement come in. And that is the thing that we've now got 52 or 53 countries signed up for it. We used to think we would be lucky to get 20. And it means that this international law is the first time that there is a law specifically focused on illegal, unregulated and unreported fishing, which means that a vessel, say a British vessel, could come into Portuguese waters that were protected. We would see it moving around and perhaps they would turn off their AIS and any other instruments. They would move around thinking they weren't being seen, gather their fish or work alongside a bigger vessel for transferring vessels, and then drive all the way to, say, Valparaiso and try and sell the fish. Before it was impossible. Now we can see them doing it. We can analyze on the satellite surveillance the movements they made at sea, whether they were conducive to long lining or being in support of another group of fishing vessels. We can tell when they get to Valparaiso and we can prosecute that ship. So this is revolutionary. And only last week, I think it was, the UN has agreed to look at the high seas and within 2 years to come up with a new high seas agreement. Yeah. And with, you know, Tiago's background and a whole other group of smart legal people, we're now in the business of having enforceable environmental law that is going to bring people to justice for not looking after the planet first. So I'm massively excited about the ocean. I don't think we can all sit back and just let it happen. It's going to be great. We need to keep the pressure on and the focus on. But I believe that within my lifetime, for sure, we are going to see vast amounts of the ocean protecting and a new way of thinking where it really is nature first and not nature happens to be the responsibility of someone else. It's nature first. And I think that's where we are. So you're right. I'm optimistic.
Yes, you are. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. This was a very optimistic and brilliant introduction to our theme. Okay. Our second illustrious speaker is Tiago Pitta Cunha. We all know him. He has been working in the last 2 decades in the area of ocean policies, whilst a legislator in the UN, in the government of Portugal, in the European Commission. Tiago has been the face that we usually associate with not just the oceans in Portugal, but what the oceans means and can do for Portugal, even in terms of our identity. He has promoted the strategic importance of maritime issues, which I think is one of the key points he will bring us, not only for Portugal, but also for Europe as a strategic actor, both in Lisbon and in Brussels. He also wrote this essay, Portugal and the Sea, from the collection of the Fundação Francisco Manuel de Santos. It's a very small essay, like all of them, but it's a brilliant book that I strongly encourage you all to read it. For me, it was very important because it enabled me to think about Portugal and the sea in a very, very structured way. Not just the past, not just the discoveries, not something distant, but something very present in our daily lives. So, Tiago, with this introduction, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Raquel. I'm really embarrassed with your introduction. If you don't mind, I'll speak from here, as standing helps me speaking. And I was going to say that I needed to retribute such kind words and says that we could not imagine a better chairperson for this debate as someone that is a professor of international relations, because the theme of the debate is really, indeed, it's ocean conservation, but also geopolitical factors. And when we speak about geopolicy or geostrategy, we are talking about international relations. But let me say as well in the beginning how pleased we are, the Oceano Azul Foundation, for co-organizing this event with the Clube de Lisboa. And in fact, how we were challenged by the Clube de Lisboa, I have to say, we have to recognize the ownership of the initiative comes from the Clube de Lisboa, that really understood that it was time to do this crossing between ocean sustainability, ocean conservation. That's what we do at the Oceano Azul Foundation, and international relations, geopolitics. Of course, that in saying so, I should have a word of thanks to Embaixador Francisco Seixas da Costa, with whom I had the pleasure and the honor to have worked in the United Nations under his leadership when he was Perm Rep at the UN, Portuguese UN mission. And Fernando Cardoso, who has been tirelessly organizing this event with all our team. I see some of our colleagues here, and I thank them very much as well for that. And of course, because what you said, Raquel, about Paul, you made my life very easy on that, so I don't need to tell you about Paul. Raquel spoke, he spoke, so I only need to thank you very, very much for all your support, for all your working with the Oceano Azul Foundation, and also for coming at this very tight schedule of yours to Lisbon. Really, thank you very much. Thank you. Well, the main focus of this brief presentation will be to explain what is the connection between ocean conservation and geopolicy. Because I don't think that at first sight one will understand the connection. We know, of course, from our history books that geography always shaped politics and policies and strategies. And we know that relevant states have explored well their geographies and have developed geo-strategies which were at the basis of their fundamental options for political and economic development. And of course, in history we can also look at examples, and the country from where Paul comes from, the UK, is one clear example of a country that understood the specificity of its geography and that has explored this specificity to its advantage on a very sound basis, to say the least, and for a long time. Holland is another case of a country that is probably very small in territorial area, but has this opportunity of being in a very strategic place in the North Sea, and also used and explored that quite well with all the trade that it carried out in past centuries and still does. And of course, Portugal is also one of these examples. We shouldn't go farther than that. We are indeed a very special country. I say many times that what we have of more specific is our geography. It's not even the language, because our language is spoken by so many other countries that is not a specificity of Portugal. But we are the only European country that, if we don't count of microstates like San Marino or Monaco, is the only country that only has one terrestrial neighbor. All the other countries, even now, Denmark with a bridge to Sweden has two neighbors, but we only have one neighbor, and that of course should, and it did in the past, shaped all our policies and our strategies and indeed our history as well. But of course, geopolitical power in the past was found in armed fleets and in colonized territories. So what does this have to do with ocean conservation? I think this is really the question for me, and the question also for somehow this debate. And the answer, I think, is going to be very important for a country like Portugal, where the ocean is again becoming a matter for political, for state consideration, where the ocean has again came into our strategic collective understanding of ourselves and our thoughts. Well, I think that the first reason why the two issues are getting closer, it's because ocean conservation, and as Paul has explained, is moving higher in the international politic arena. Let me go back to the 70s, when ocean environment, the marine environment, became a concern for the first time. And when we look into the works that member states of the United Nations did in drafting UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention Law of the Sea, we already had in all the delegations people that were concerned with the future of the marine environment. So we have a chapter on this convention about marine environment with a lot of principles that are right principles, and even in the preamble saying that all the problems of the oceans are interrelated and need to be treated as a whole. So the idea of integrated management comes from there, but unfortunately, more than 50 years have passed, 2 generations have worked, and the issue of ocean conservation has been only going downhill. And here I'm not as positive probably as Paul, I'm sorry about that. But looking at what happened makes me think that this is probably the reason why the oceans are more important politically. It's because they are more degraded in environmental terms. I went to work in the United Nations in the mid-90s, and at that time, I think there were 3 themes that were probably on parallel terms. It was the forests, the oceans, and climate change. This was before Kyoto. So I have to say that when you look into these 3 agendas, what happened? Well, forests skyrocketed because of satellite technology. Countries that had huge forests could not say anymore that there was no deforestation because everyone could see. Yeah. So forests became very popular among public opinion. So I'm from the times when Bono from the U2 and Sting would go and sing for forests along with indigenous leaders. This never happened in the oceans. We still do not have our Bono and Sting for the oceans, and we don't have still our indigenous peoples. Climate change was a mere scientific issue at that time. It was an issue for scientists with a lot of debate. Of course, that we know what happened to climate change. Climate change moved from being a scientific issue to become an environmental issue. And it moved, in the beginning of this century, from being an environmental issue to become a political issue, because it became first an economic issue. Mr. Stern, or Sir Stern, came up with its report, who told us that our GDPs would shrink big time if we would do nothing about it. And of course, I have no doubts that nowadays, climate change is not a political issue. It is the political issue of the 21st century. And that, we might have not have realized that as well, yet, that is going to, in many ways, have more importance in our lives, in our societies, in our economies, than we still can understand at this moment. So, where are ocean conservation on this? We are not there yet, as I said, but the issue is growing up. And why is it growing up? Unfortunately, for the bad reasons. It's growing up because in 2017, we had the reports of the massive destruction of coral reefs through the last El Nino. From 2015 to 2016, the Great Barrier Reef lost 1/3 of its territorial area. It seems that because of climate change as well, and because of the ocean absorbing 90% of the excess heat produced by climate change and CO2 emissions and greenhouse emissions, we are killing our corals that have been around for more than 400 million years, so much before we do. And what is important to understand is that the impact of the disappearance of corals is going to have huge repercussions for our societies and our economies, because although it's less than 1% of the area of the ocean, it's probably between 25 and 30% of the whole marine biodiversity that will disappear along with corals. Then, of course, we had in these last years an unprecedented succession of hurricanes in the Atlantic and typhoons in the Pacific. Last year was incredible. I forgot all the names of Maria, José, Irma, yes. All the names of the hurricanes that, what do the hurricanes do? They destroy the marine ecosystems around the islands, around coastal areas. They destroy the blue economy, the maritime economy of small island developing states and also coastal areas of large states like the US or Mexico. So they have huge impacts as well. And then, of course, a very important issue came up. Plastics. Yes. Because plastics has a very important human factor. We have been assisting to the degradation of fisheries, marine fisheries, for decades. But as long as we have something on our plate, we don't mind. If it's not tuna, it's salmon. If it's not salmon, will be scabbard fish or whatever it is. But plastics, no. Plastics is another problem, because plastics, they come back to haunt us, because they go into the trophic chain, the food chain of the ocean, and they come back in our seafood, in our precious seafood. So we will be plastifying ourselves by throwing plastics into the ocean. And that became very sexy for the public opinion, for the press. So for all these reasons, we have much more political attention to the oceans. We had the UN Oceans Conference on Sustainable Development Goal 14 in 2017. And every state came to the podium and said what they are doing and they are planning to do to save the ocean. So there we go, it's becoming geopolitics. We at that time could see that pushing for ocean conservation now gives political gains in the international arena. So the things are getting together. And here Portugal probably is one of the good examples that have understood this quite earlier. When Ambassador Francisco da Costa was Perm Rep in the United Nations, we organized ourselves a couple of important elections, because Portugal at that time had already an agenda for sustainable development. Our agenda was not for fishing more. Actually, I think it is even important to understand that Portugal for many years was regarded as a fishing country, a fishing state. So our image was very much the image of a brother of Spain, for instance, in fishing efforts. But what Portugal managed to do in the United Nations is to understand that sustainable development of the ocean should be the key, should be the priority, and should be our agenda. I think that this agenda has been paying off very well, because there are many ocean countries, starting with the small island developing states, that indeed have looked at Portugal and the Portuguese leadership as an example, and have also allied with us on other agendas of international relations that are not connected to the oceans, but that make the oceans becoming more a geopolitical issue. Now Portugal has the organization of the 2020 UN Oceans Conference, the next one that is coming. And here there is an opportunity to shape the next decade for the oceans, the decade from 20 to 30. So of course it is very important on geopolitical terms. And I hope that by then, because I think I have exhausted already almost 15 minutes, I have shown that oceans, conservation, political, geopolitical and geostrategies connect and are important. I even think that in the future this is going to be more so, because the future of this century will be sustainable environment. If the 19th century was the century of the Industrial Revolution and of capitalism and capital, and if we can think that at least in the Northern Hemisphere, the 20th century was the century of the welfare state, of the victory of political movements such as social democracy, Christian democracy, then this century will be the century of not social sustainability, but of environmental sustainability, because we came to the conclusions that without the environmental sustainability, there will not be social sustainability or capital sustainability. So this is going to be more geopolitical even than now. Does this matter for Portugal? Of course it matters. I think that we have to say yes, and we have to say a resounding yes. And why? Because even for Portugal, this is more important. All this agenda fits completely into Portuguese national interests in what relates to the ocean. Basically because Portugal does not have a very important manufactured maritime economy. We don't have a very capital-intense industrial merchant fleet, or shipbuilding, or other industries. But we are second to none in Europe in what relates to marine biodiversity with two marine large ecosystems, one in Iberia and the other one in Macaronesia, including the Azores and Madeira. And the future of the blue economy will be very much the blue natural capital. So the nature capital, the nature-based solutions for our fighting of climate change and our decarb actions. That's why I think that this is a win-win situation. So my last comment is, how should one develop an agenda for ocean conservation, given that is so important and that might bring so many political gains? Well, of course, I'm not going to speak about the state, and I'm not going to give lessons to any state or any country. But I can speak for the Oceano Azul Foundation. And here, we think, and we've been putting that in practice, that for the foundation, the way to do this is through cooperation. It's basically through international cooperation. And this is what we've been doing with National Geographic Pristine Seas. And this is an important part of our work. And I should end up by again thanking you, Paul, for coming and for helping us with this cooperation, because this is the way to go. Thank you very much, and for having paid attention.
Thank you, Tiago. That was also a very excellent presentation. We have agreed previously that I would just ask, some questions for both speakers to just kick off the debate, and then we pass the floor to you. I think that two questions mainly have arise here from both your talks. One would be for Paul. Yesterday we talked a lot about generations. This is to say the generation of our children or of our nieces and nephews, I don't have children, is a more, in terms of the environment, has a greater awareness than we do. So in that sense, what can be done to help that generation be able to claim what is going to be their world, literally, and what can we do about it? Okay, this would be my very small question to you, but don't, he's going to get a very tough one as well. For Tiago, we talked about geopolitics. When I look at the world from an IR perspective, from an international relations perspective, I see a lot of competition in terms of power when I look at the oceans. We have had a superpower that dominates the world, the United States. It has the best blue water navy that it will be some time before the Chinese catch up. But precisely because of one of your points, because of the degradation of the oceans, ocean resources are becoming more, they trigger greater competition. So in that sense, and taking into account all your diplomatic and many dimensions of work, do you see possible a cooperation at the level of the Permanent Five, mostly between the United States, Russia, and China? To my students, when we talk about, for instance, within Asia, when we talk about Russia, which has a big Asian dimension, I usually joke with them and I say, Russia must be the only country in the world that is praying for global warming, because then it will have a big extension of its coastline and the North Pole defrozen. Okay? So in that sense, do you see this coming? Because in terms of power, when we look at the world, we see this huge competition. It's about the assets, it's about the sustainability, but it's also about power. One of the great key points of your essay was precisely to point out so many empires, so many societies that triumphed in the world. Precisely why? Because they had naval power. So as you see, it's a very easy question as well.
Very easy.
Paul, please.
Well, thank you, and thanks for the opportunity to speak about future generations. There's a number of things there. Firstly, to answer you, Tiago, with why don't we have the Bono or the U2 or the Rolling Stones of the ocean? And it's partly because most political leaders and influencers for the ocean will have grown up in cities or towns or anywhere, and they will have walked with their parents through parks, urban parks. They will have gone camping with their parents. They would have gone fishing from a bank in a river. They will have started to enjoy a sense of parkland and terrestrial beauty at a very young age. And then as they got older, maybe they would have been with, youth groups or school groups, or been with their family again, and had these more sort of distant experiences, and travelled to beautiful forests. And unbeknownst to them, they will have learnt to like it and even love special areas. So when they are in difficult decision making, now they are in a position of influence, they have something within them that connects them to beautiful terrestrial areas. Butterflies, whatever it might be, beautiful trees, massive redwoods. And what we need now is to think, how do we get future leaders of the ocean and influence of the ocean to go in the sea? So I remember 3 years ago, I think it was, I was in Brussels, and I gave a talk in Parliament about, and it was slightly tongue-in-cheek, as we say, a slight joke, but I made the case that every school curriculum in Europe must have scuba diving in the curriculum, because I felt it was the best way to learn about anything. It was the best way to learn about physics, mathematics, physical performance, science. Let's get everybody diving. So although it's impossible, there was a sense of, why don't we take it as a big international social responsibility to get our young ones out in the sea early and often, in the tide pools, get them out fishing, get them out diving, get them sailing, become more ocean people, become sea creatures. So that's something I think is beginning to happen. That's the first thing. Global leaders need to be divers, or at least part of it. And the second thing is a clear understanding of shifting baselines. This shifting baselines is a very powerful thought process that shows that if we're not careful, every single generation expects less and less from nature. And this is where, people, let's say me, I remember doing a lot of fishing in the Florida Keys, and we used to get a lot of mahi-mahi and eat them, and it was easy fishing, and you'd see the pictures on the wall of people who were catching fish, and they were all, say, about this big. But then if you looked back at people that were there some years ago, the fish they were catching were absolutely massive, and there was lots of them. Equally very happy people standing there with a cold beer and a fishing rod covered in salt. Look what I caught. Then my pictures were exactly the same. And now when I look at those pictures of the Florida Keys, the fish are tiny, little ones. But the same pictures, a bunch of people standing there with cold beers really happy. So that's shifting baselines, and we have to be aware of that so that our generations don't start to expect less and less through. So that's how I feel we're going to capture future generations. And you only have to go to a school anywhere, particularly in Europe, or the States, and all the kids are talking about marine plastic.
Yes.
So luckily, we've demonstrated that we have reached that moment where we change when we have to. Yes. The situation with marine plastic is so powerful. It's in us. I think it's February, I'll be going to Sweden for the UN, where they're going to take some tissue samples from me and some blood from me, and then they're going to tell me what my body burden is. And that's how much persistent organic pollutants I have in my body, as way of a new UN project that I'm part of. And I know that a big lump of that is going to be plastic, right? So it's in us. So it's a big motivator. If it's in us, we're going to do something about it, and the kids have got that. So that's my little take on the next generation.
Thank you so much. Great. Tiago.
Well, it's not an easy question, and
I'm pleased I got my one.
Yeah. Well, when we look into world powers and the oceans, we can look from several dimensions. The oceans, at least, have an important component in some of the biggest challenges that we face in the 21st century. One is, of course, climate change, as I referred, because oceans and climate change are intrinsically linked. The ocean, at the same time, passing Paris agreements and 2 degrees, because, as I said, 90% of the heat is accumulated in the ocean. So just to give you an idea, we just read a report of 2 Chinese scientists from the Academy of Science of China, in which, in a single year, I think it was 2017, the ocean accumulated the energy because of excess heat that corresponds to 600 times the energy production of China in 1 year, of China in 1 year.
Yep.
So it's massive. So climate change and oceans are very important, and there will be a lot of consequences for powers. Globalization is about the oceans, because globalization is about international trade. international trade travels by sea. 90% of the trade goes by sea. So without the oceans, there is no international trade. And that's where some of the bargaining is starting. That's why the Chinese have come up with the Silk routes and the new belts. That's because of oceans and globalization. Then we have energy, of course. Energy is very important. The oceans are key not only to produce energy. 80% of the capex of the oil and gas industry is offshore nowadays. And because of also the security of supply. We've seen what happened in Europe with pipelines coming from the east, and how important it is to have sustainable, safe tankers to transport oil, for instance. The double-hull tankers that we have in Europe nowadays after the Pristine, the Prestige and the Erika oil spills.
Yeah.
So energy and oceans are also connected very much. I find very interesting when a country has energy very high in its geostrategic agenda for defense, and then the oceans are quite low on that list, which is the case of Portugal, by the way.
Yes.
Because without the oceans, there is no energy case. The oceans are key for the energy. Then, of course, the environmental sustainability. The oceans are the big ecosystem of the planet. There is no other one. If the oceans are upset in their system, well, the whole environmental ecosystem of land, of which we depend, absolutely, will be upset. And finally, there is the pure security reasons. The oceans are key for security matters, as we can see in the South China Sea, but as we can see also in the Black Sea, or in the Mediterranean, or in other oceans, or in the Arctic Sea, more and more, or even, I would say, in Europe. 2/3 of the European Union borders, 2/3 are marine borders. So, for Europe, the maritime defense is probably as important as land defense. And on all these issues, we see signs of bigger tension. But this goes, unfortunately, with the magnum problem of the planet in this century, which is that we have reduced nature to a very small part of what the planet is. And we have scaled up our economies and our societies to most of what the planet is. So what is happening? It's happening what we see in the animal kingdom when you have mammals from the same species and they have to control their territories. If the territories are not overcrowded, they solve their disputes amicably. One is bigger than the other, and that's enough for the other to go away. But when these territories are overcrowded, they only solve their disputes until one dies.
Yes.
And this is unfortunately the metaphor that one has probably to come about when we think about the oceans, the futures, and the dilapidation of our planet's environmental values. Then I would say just one last thing, which is so that in the ocean, this is important, the powers are not exactly as they are on land. This is very important because of UNCLOS and because of EEZs and continental shelves.
Yep.
So we cannot say that a country that is very powerful on land because it has a critical mass of land territory that is very important, like Iran, for instance, in the region where it is, or it sits, has such an importance on marine terms. Because, well, or a country like Germany, don't go too far. Germany has no ocean and has very little sea. But it's very important in terms of land territory in Europe, and not only in terms of critical mass. And look at the case of Portugal. Portugal is the 110th biggest country of the United Nations on land territory. But on ocean territory, Portugal is one of the 15 biggest countries in the world. So that also, when we think about international relations and about powers, if we think in ocean terms, we should think on this way as well.
Great.
This is going to be important because if the future of our economies will be very much the bioeconomy and the environment, as I am sure it will, well, if you have a lot of biodiversity and a lot of environment, if you are a powerhouse for environmental values, you should keep them. You should protect them. You should invest on them.
Thank you so much, Tiago. That was a very good answer to my tough question.
Great.
Now, we give the floor to the audience. I'll ask you to just present yourselves, and please, 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 please make an effort to make a brief question so that we have enough time for everybody, and because Paul really has to leave and catch the plane, otherwise he will not come back to Lisbon in this year at least. Okay? I see that lady there. Yes?
Good morning.
Good morning.
I am Maria Amélia Martins Loução. I am the president of Portuguese Ecological Society. I like very much all these topics, and I catch particularly two words: environmental sustainability. That we know that it's very important, but in a way, and being an ecologist, it's a little bit strange to put all these aspects, because in a way, men are here and we are increasing our population. So in a way, how can we talk about environmental sustainability when we need to feed the world? And we also know that cow production has a huge impact in climate change and in also the biodiversity of land. So what happens to the oceans?
Thank you very much. More questions, please? One more.
Thank you. My name is Arnaldo. I come from Cabo Verde, which is an ocean-born nation.
Yes.
Some centuries ago, but now known for exporting the hurricanes to United States. It's the only export we've been able to do.
No, you also export very good football players.
And music.
And music.
Music.
And landscapes and this and that, and culture.
But I had in my, I appreciate a lot what has been said. And my question is the knowledge and the sharing of knowledge. We are in a country where a prince called João, he became the king, João II, made knowledge about navigation in the Atlantic Ocean the big issue for building a maritime empire. And he knew after the death of the Henry Navigator that knowledge would be, knowledge to know how to go and come back to Portugal would be the key issue for his time. And I remember for my country, like for example, prevent the illegal fishing is a key issue for us. And having the knowledge is not an easy question.
Okay.
And I had in mind if it's possible to work, for us to work together more, to wide open the contacts and the knowledge, and to share. All the action has to be done.
Thank you very much, Arnaldo, for your question. Who wants to go first?
Yes, the question from you, ma'am. It's a great question. It's always on my mind because I think about overpopulation regularly, and it feels to me as if we're involved in some sort of out-of-control science experiment with the burgeoning population, and all the forecasts make for pretty grim reading when you look at how many resources will we need when we're that many billion, and how many resources, or indeed how many planets will we need when we're that many billion. So this is going to be a tough nut to crack because we haven't been very successful in managing our population growth. The only place where it was successful, and I remember it well, was in Bangladesh. And it relates a lot to your thing, Tiago. When you put everybody together you know, wilderness, and all the animals are in there and they get along well if there's plenty of space, because there's a bit of, sort of, I'm bigger than you, so I'll go off. But then when you're all together, things are going to happen. Bangladesh had the world's most densest population. And I remember doing some reporting from Bangladesh in 2004, I think it was. And I was sitting on a toilet in Dhaka, working out on the back of my hand, because it said I was going to say to the camera out there, the camera was out there, that Bangladesh is the most crowded place on earth. And in fact, if you took the whole of the world's population and put them into the lower 50 states in the UK, so I'm not including Alaska and Hawaii, put them all there, it wouldn't be as crowded as Bangladesh is today. And I was there with my phone at a load of numbers and doing long division and working out per square meter. And it's true. That was true at the time, that Bangladesh was so dense. But their resources are very limited. And it wasn't until Muhammad Yunus, the great political leader and influencer Muhammad Yunus, he's the man who, you know, micro banking and all the rest. And he came up with the idea that he needed to communicate, get knowledge out there to somehow turn it into the single issue that would change Bangladesh. And he did it almost single-handedly. And now the population growth in Bangladesh is very close to being much more sustainable. And I wonder if that's what's going to happen to the whole planet. Are we going to wait until we have to change? Or are we going to think about overpopulation at the same time as we think of loss of habitat, loss of biodiversity, overfishing, marine plastic pollution, all these other stresses that come in? And I think that putting them in the framework of the overpopulation is a great one, because it really brings us to that obvious thing that we all know, that the planet has only got so many resources. So I like it when overpopulation pops up, and David Attenborough uses it all the time. I think it's a very powerful sort of driver to help us think. So when it comes to the ocean, well, the best thing we can do is to protect what we have. There might be this out-of-control experiment going on out there somewhere, but we just have to, you know, maybe it's a good driver. If politically there isn't the will, if financially there are difficulties, if there's other fears about protecting the ocean, that can be a useful tool to say, well, you know, the planet is going this way. We need to protect what we have, both terrestrially and at sea. But it's a great comment. Thank you. Yeah.
Tiago, do you want to?
Sure. In relation to your question, I think that we have a problem to start with. And the problem is that we already came to a point where it's difficult to feed ourselves, our societies, on a sustainable way. So we consume almost 3 times the natural resources of the planet every year. So we are consuming the future of the other generations. Next generations that will come will not have no resources because we are using their resources ahead of time. Are we really doing this? We are completely. One of these figures that really made me perplexed recently was to find out that we humans, we are 40% of the biomass of all the mammals of the planet. Close to 40% of the biomass of all the mammals of the planet are our species. It's our species. And out of the other 60% of mammals, 70% of them are our food. So we ate the planet. And we are now in the situation where we have ate the planet. We ate the forests to warm up. We ate the fish and the animals to feed ourselves. And we are now in a situation that is going to be difficult, but the fact is that from now to 2050, we'll be 10 billion.
Yeah.
So at this moment, we will need at least more 30 to 40% of proteins to feed the 10 billion. How are we going to do this? Because if we do this through the traditional ways that we've been doing that, forget climate change. Because agriculture is one of the biggest contributing sectors for CO2 emissions and carbon. So this is a problem. We won't be able to do that. So the vision of the Oceano Azul Foundation for the century, and that's where we are optimistic, is that this century we will work tireless and with obsession in decoupling economic growth from environmental degradation. What does it take to do that? Well, it's going to take the biggest of all revolutions. We will have to change our model of economic development, not the one we are developing since the Industrial Revolution, but the one that we are developing since the Agricultural Revolution. We'll have to go beyond the Agricultural Revolution because it's about feeding people that you're talking here. And I think that we have the technology, and if we have the willingness, the political vision, we will be able to do that in the century, like we were able to do other things before. But of course, that makes that little mammals that have no useful use for us, because they are not us or our food, will be critical. We will understand that to protect them is to save us. And I think that this is what is going to happen, and the evolution is going in that sense. So I don't think that we'll have so many cows around in 10, 15 years as we have now. I don't think that we'll be eating so much meat. I think that we'll probably eat much more algae and much more of other products that do not require freshwater products, are not produced through agricultural means, but are probably produced other ways, either in our oceans or in our labs. And that is going to be probably the step. But of course, that takes us too much into the future, and I want to answer then the second question. Maybe I could just go to the second question. Well, the answer to your question is exactly what I said, or how I finished my introduction, is international cooperation and cooperation. You are absolutely right. There is a huge inequity of know-how in the world. And when we look into the oceans, this inequity is part of the problem, because I would say that the overwhelming majority of coastal states do not know how to deal their oceans. They don't have the scientific knowledge to understand the ecosystem-based approach that is necessary for your policies, for your special planning, for your managing of the ocean. Very few countries indeed have this, very few. Not all the countries of the European Union have them, by no means. So you really have to have this sharing of knowledge. This is called capacity building. How you have to have this flow, and you have to organize that, and there is no organization doing that at the moment, and you'll have to share that knowledge. But until then, you need to save what's left, as Paul said. Yeah. So you need to do marine protected areas. We need to buy time. We need to buy time to one day being able to change our economic model of development, and until then, we have to take draconian measures in saving what's left.
And if I may, yes, your question is a great one, because when people first look at the way we understand geography or the way we understand international knowledge, there's a sense that if people are online, they know it all. It's almost as if they've been there and done it themselves. So your comment is a great one, because it reminds people, unless you really understand the front line, really go to Cape Verde, go there, do the work, see what the ocean is like, understand the field work that goes on in your country, you can't act on it. People need to be there and do it and see it. So I love that sort of comment. But you know, it also proves that it's not as easy to share knowledge as we think. You know, in my world, you think, well, it's easy. You know, we've got satellite monitoring. You know, monitoring and the enforcement is easy because of these international laws and all these other great things that are going to happen. But it's got to, the energy for understanding it and making a difference has got to happen in country. You know, someone like, us three can't suddenly arrive there and make it happen. It's got to be the will within the country. Even in Portugal, I mean, the Azores won't be protected until it happens within the Azorean government and the Portuguese government to make it happen. And so, you know, you outlined a great challenge, and I would say that the knowledge sharing, although it appears easy these days, does take a big force of will from the country. You know, you hear about satellite monitoring and the fact, and I can take you to small islands that have a laptop and they're watching vessels in their area, and they can report on it and track it. It gets reported back in France, back in Britain, and back in the US, but they can see it actually happening. So that to me looks like a great win, and we can organise a team to come to you and work out how do we fund this satellite tracking and put it on your island, but it's got to come from the island. There's got to be that will. to make it happen. So you've outlined a great problem. And you know, outside of this, I mean, write to us too. We can, you know, help make contacts and, you know, help drive that through. And it underscores what probably will happen to the Azores. You know, it'll happen from this country. Yeah.
Thank you so much. More questions? Younger generation. Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Lisa. I'm a European international law student.
Okay, here we go. Right. Thank you. Yes.
Okay, again. My name is Luisa, and I'm an international and European law student, currently on exchange here. And my question for you would be, what kind of advice would you give to the young generation and taking action and like to be most efficient? Because as you already said, the awareness is there. But then I always think like the problem is like, where do you start? And a second question is, when we look at climate change in the future and see like superpowers as the US, like opting out of environmental agreements like the Paris Agreement, for example, how do you see the future of climate change when there's a lot of stuff done by countries, for example, in the European Union, but then there are like those big countries like the US who, I mean, seem to do not care that much?
That was such a nice way of putting it. Thank you very much.
Great. Great question.
It's a great question. Thank you.
Thanks.
Could we have another one? Younger generation?
Hello, I'm not the young generation, almost. My name is Ana. I work for a Portuguese NGO named IMVF. I would say it's the biggest Portuguese non-governmental organization, but I will be biased, although it's true. So my question, the European Commission, in terms of awareness raising, campaigning and advocacy, has just stated that the connection between planet and people is one of the priorities. In particular, to engage youth from 15 years old until 35 years old on climate change / climate action. I would just like to ask both speakers just one or two brief insights according to your expertise and also your life experience, how we can engage youth that is so overwhelmed with information and social media, and what happens in the Facebook, it's the truth. How can we engage this target group in climate action? Thank you so much.
Great.
Thank you.
Great questions. Yes, Lisa, I enjoyed your one. I mean, my tip for how do you, in your position, influence and make change happen and make these things happen is it's very important that you tell your own story. You know, by that I mean that I always advise young ones or people of any age to get out there in the front line and have some good, meaningful work experiences in the front line, so that when you're talking to someone, you know, wearing a suit who, you know, he maybe doesn't have that feeling of the wet places, the ocean, or the, you know, the canopy jungle, or whatever it is, whatever environmental issue you're pushing, they can tell that you have. So you walk in there, and you know how it works. You walk into someone's office and they've just come back from a great diving trip, or they've just come back from the Wakan corridor walking, and you open the office, you expect to see them, and you go, holy smokes, what have you been doing? And there's something about that look, and that's a very powerful motivator, and it's the platform to operate from. So I would say, not knowing the specifics of where you're going, but I would say absolutely get your frontline stuff going, so you are that person from the front line. You're talking from person, and that makes a big difference when there's a group of you and you begin to make actions happen. And your second part of the question about your disappointment to see big nations going back on international environmental agreements. I share that frustration, and I'm hoping that now we see changes in international environmental law coming up. Decisions like that are the kind of thing that get global leaders put behind those bars in The Hague, prosecuted for crimes against the environment. That's where they are going. Now, I know it's not going to happen tomorrow, but I was in The Hague after the Azores expedition, and I was cycling through there, and I thought, just imagine that day, you know, where we're all in The Hague. And we go up, and behind the bars, you know, there's that one man in particular, a few others, and you go, there you go, you know. Tiago and his mates, we do have enforceable environmental laws. So there you go. Get yourself to the front line and keep dreaming about behind the bars in The Hague with his work.
Can I just jump in on this one? I think that, you know, when you look at the fact that, to put it nicely, the United States and the current administration has retreated itself from leadership, it's also an opportunity for others. Look at Europe, as Tiago was pointing out, and in environmental issues, particularly because it is one of the greatest sources of popular unrest in China, sustainable environment. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, when you have a retreat from leadership, from the superpower we were all used to, I remember the Cold War, I remember the two Germanys, I remember the Soviet Union and so forth. We were used to the United States providing that leadership. So maybe, I know it's not an easy, for Europe it's not easy at all, but it's probably a good opportunity for other strategic actors to rise. Environment is clearly one of them. Sorry.
I would probably pick up on what you said, Raquel, and say that what I said in my first answer about the powers of the Security Council, that on ocean matters, there are other countries that can have a leadership, and I gave the example of Portugal. Mm-hmm. This is the same for these kind of situations. If you look into climate change, one of the countries that is a giant for climate change leadership, it's Fiji. Yeah. Fiji was the president of COP23. And Fiji is doing a work that is unbelievable for a country that is a microstate. So on environmental arena, the size doesn't matter so much as it matters probably in other arenas. So I think that, like Raquel said, there will be the opportunity for others to emerge. And I think that very much the future of international relations will be even more shaped around coalitions of the willing, around like-mindedness. That is going to be important, play a really important role in the alliance of the future. And of course, then when I look, for instance, into Portugal international relations, I realize that we don't have any particular alliances for environmental matters or for this kind of matters. Never occurred to us because it was never a political issue. Yeah. But because it is becoming a political issue, we'll have to build these alliances in the future. And they might be built not with the traditional allies that we have, but with other allies. And of course, when it matters to the oceans, Norway is a clear case. For Portugal, for instance, within Europe. Having said that, you also spoke about the youth, and you and I also spoke about the youth. I was going to say that my answer has 3 points about how to engage the youth, what can the youth does. There are 3 points. You can vote, you can buy, and you can post. Mm-hmm. This is the way.
Thank you so much. This is great. I will be quoting this one.
Yeah, very good.
Very good. More questions, please. Oh, the younger generation is coming up. Okay.
Hello, very good morning. My name is Chloe, and I have a question regarding the capacity building that you mentioned just before. I think answering this question. My question is, or I have two in fact, is who should be sitting in the table when we negotiate a treaty regarding the sustainable development environment? Who should be really, because for example in my very, very small experience, we tried to negotiate a treaty for between Timor, East Timor and Australia. And it was so complicated technically, really. So we kind of were completely depending on people who actually knew what they were talking about regarding the law of the sea. So the first question is, who should be sitting in the table representing those countries, really? Should they be lawyers? Should they be
scientists?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And secondly, is there in the UNICLOS a positive obligation to actually negotiate? I'm sure we have very clearly an obligation to not cause any harms with our there for the countries, for the states, a positive obligation to actually engage in treaty making in order to prevent or to mitigate the problems that we're causing in the ocean?
Okay, good question.
Great
and
stuff.
there was another one back there, and I have this one.
Hi, my name is Emilia, and I'm a student. And I wanted to know if for Portugal is not it's strategic and sustainable the fossil fuel exploration in the Portuguese coast.
Fossil fuel exploration.
Yes, because we talked about the strategic moment for Portugal to rise and to use its geography to rise and
To rise again. We like to say it like this, to rise again. Okay, two very good questions. Who would like to start?
Yes, great. I love the one about the who should be at the table, you know, when it comes to negotiations. And in my dream, everybody at that negotiating table has grown up as someone close to nature. You know, they've had the, as I described, they've had the stuff of growing up in urban parks and travelling on to terrestrial stuff. They've become divers, they're fishermen, they're sailors. They've got a connection with nature that is within them and can't be denied. So when the negotiations begin to make sense and it's all blindingly obvious, then that global leader, that influencer, she says, well, this is all making sense. We just have to do it. And then she ends up working out the legal side and all the other treaty side, but you've captured that individual or that group of individuals because they can see it makes sense. And then they go through the technicalities. The problem is, as you well described, when there's at the table, everybody is an expert on political process and the legal side of things, and yet probably none of them are fishermen or sailors or divers or climbers or walkers or canoers and all these other things. So I think, although I often say it, that we need to get young ones out there early and often engaged in you know, physical engagement with the planet all the time, then I believe that it really is a big thing, because then you won't be sitting with these bureaucrats at these tables. You'll be sitting with people that use the bureaucracy as another step, but basically they love it, they know it and love it. So, and I think it's an interesting one about, is there a requirement in UNCLOS for negotiation? I guess, is there?
For negotiation about?
Yeah, in the law, you mean? That it's a legal part? You know, I don't know. I always assumed it would be as part of the process. You may know more than we do. You know, we need to get you down. But it's a great, so to me, it's all about remembering these people have the authority and the power to make the decisions and make the agreements, but they have to mean it inside. They don't just have to be looking after their own interests, that they want to be elected again next year, or they want a safe bet against a certain group of people. They have to really mean it and love it and know it, you know. So that's the next, you know.
And I think that also connected to your point is the issue of, do you have the expertise? Do you have the knowledge? Because I think one of the things that clearly afflicts smaller country is brain drain, right? So in that sense, when you're negotiating with a bigger power or a country that has greater financial advantages in being able to put all of that in the table, that's when you have to call the specialists like Paul. Okay?
And him.
Tiago, please.
So on more this kind of representation, legal sitting at the table, that's clearly for me a question of governance, very much a question of governance. In this little essay, in chapter 6, it's about ocean governance.
Yeah.
And there, this was already many years ago, I made my vision very clear. And my vision is that we are still managing public affairs like Napoleon did. Because if you look into the Council of Ministers of Portugal or any continental European country nowadays, apart maybe from the environment, most of the other areas, portfolios already existed at the time of Napoleon. And so we continue to look into our public affairs on a very vertical, anthropocentric view. You know, it's justice for men, it's the economy, so money for men, things like that. So we need totally, I think in the future as well, to start working in different terms in governance ways. And so in the ocean, it's quite clear a case that demands, that cries for that horizontal governance, because the ocean has impacts in all different portfolios. It has an impact on the economics, so the Ministry for Economy, on energy, on tourism, on foreign office, on international relations, therefore, on environment, on fisheries, on transport, on transportation, shipping. So who is going to take care of it? And the fact is now is that it's very difficult, because in many countries you have a Minister for Environment that wants to protect the ocean very much, and then you have a Minister for Fisheries that wants to protect the fishers.
Mm-hmm.
And this is what happened. So you go to a meeting for fishers and quotas in the European Commission, and the Minister for Fisheries goes there and brings all the fish he can bring to the country. And then you have the Minister for Environment saying, no, we should preserve our biodiversity and our marine, blah, blah, blah. So, of course, there is a huge work that we need to do in civilization terms. The ocean has a blue part in different ministerial portfolios. And we will only be able to do this step once you'll have an integrated maritime policy and the government that realizes that all the different ministers of the different portfolios need to know their part in that ocean policy, in that ocean area. So the Minister for Transports needs to know what to do about marine transport, because I cannot remove maritime transport from the other modes of transport, like it's done. Even in Portugal, it's done, because the Ministry of the Sea has transportation, because, of course, transportation needs to go in the intermodal connection with rail and road. So I think that we need to invest more in the software rather than in the hardware. Having said this, it's of course that it's clear that we work in silos, and it's the same in Portugal or in any European country, which is we work on climate change under the UNFCCC. The UNFCCC, it's run and negotiated by people from the Ministry for Environment. But the ocean has a huge impact in climate change. But people from ocean do not go to the meetings of the UNFCCC. They go to UN meetings. Yeah. So what we did in great cooperation with the Ministry for Foreign Affairs, just last week, the Portuguese mission at the United Nations organized a meeting between a group of Friends of the Ocean with the permanent reps that are part of this group and the member states that are leading the ocean agenda on the UNFCCC, on climate change. Because they have never talked to each other. So there's a long way in terms of this governance, and that needs to be done in terms of domestic governance and international governance. That's for sure.
That's a very, very good point, Tiago.
So maybe just I would answer something in relation to your comment about oil in the coast of Portugal. Well, I can only speak for the foundation, and the foundation has a vision, as I said, that we will be able to decouple economic development from environmental degradation, because so far, since the Industrial Revolution at least, these two have been hand on hand. We create growth, economic growth, but there is always an impact on the environment, much more even. I like to say this one, which is a bit like, you know, the Brits say that football, it's 11 against 11 with a ball in between, and in the end, Germany always wins.
In the end, Germany always wins, yes.
Well,
it's very true.
Environment and the economy is the same thing. It's a game where you have environment and economy on both fields, and in the end, the economy always wins.
Yeah.
Good.
So we think that in the end, the game must be, in the future, the game must be different. And so we need to decouple this. And I gave some tips about how we would decouple that in the future. So, of course, our vision is that as a foundation, we are promoting ocean conservation, and at the same time, we are also promoting the other side of the coin, which is a new paradigm for a blue economy. That's why we have a program like the Blue Bio Value, that, by the way, was launched yesterday, where we are investing in companies, in startups, in entrepreneurs that want to develop business out of nature-based solutions, and that capitalize on the natural capital. They do not spend the natural capital, but they capitalize on it. So this is our way. And of course, I would say that oil is not included in this way. I'm not speaking for the state as well, because I'm speaking for the foundation. When I look at states, I see that there are many different options. For instance, we can look to Norway, which has a huge exploration of oil and gas. They have more than 160 wells of oil and gas active, which is the #1 country in human development in the world, but which is also looking into new ways of diversifying their economy.
Absolutely.
Each state has its own option. I'm not going to interfere with that.
Even in their sovereign fund, which they use to, they have been diversifying all investments and not being so dependent on oil.
But also Saudi Arabia is doing that.
Yeah.
Different levels of human development, and I shall say this at some point, particularly because I am a woman.
Be careful, you might be hired. You might be hired. They are hiring scholars from all over the world and are developing their educational university system in a huge ways.
All for that, but their starting point is so low.
Yeah, okay. Wow.
I'm all for that. I have a young man who has not given up in raising his hand, so.
Great. This is good. Really good.
My question is partly answered, but my name is Yella. I'm an international relations student.
Where from?
From the Netherlands.
Oh.
I study here in Lisbon. And I was wondering, growing up in the Netherlands, a lot of people talk about these projects and sustainability, especially concerning the water. We call it the fight against water.
Yes.
But there's, for instance, a young man who developed, who funded this ocean cleanup. He's only, I think, 18 years old when he funded it. He's developing advanced technologies to rid the world oceans of plastic. And I'm wondering, since I've lived abroad, I noticed that not many other people are talking about it. And my first question would be, what are other countries taking a leadership role in these projects? And what would be a platform where they can share their expertise?
Good question. Thank you very much.
Great.
Here, please. We have to balance gender.
Mas foi outro rapaz que pediu. Porque ninguém fizeram muitas perguntas.
Great.
Good morning. My name is Robert Limbu. I'm from Nepal, and
Nepal.
yeah,
Good.
I'm an international student from ISKTE. I don't have really questions, but I just came in mind. Like Nepal is a landlocked country, we don't have ocean. So when we're talking about ocean, I just came to feel about our mountains, which are melting, and the glacier. There are many glaciers which are about to explode somehow. So when we talking about sustainability of the oceans, I just came to. I think we start to think about those poor snows which they are melting and those mountains. So just comments, not really.
Thank you very much.
I think maybe we should have taken some initiatives, or is there already some initiatives is going on? I don't know.
Thank you very much. So just to make it clear, your point is on sustainability in general, not just the oceans, but mountain, climate change, warming, and melting of assets? Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. So Netherlands, Nepal, who wants to go first?
I like your comment about Netherlands, because those projects have got a huge amount of visibility, haven't they? And it's clear to me that there's lots of other great stuff going on from other countries. And it does seem a bit bemusing. You think, that's back on BBC again. And I reported on it. I did the story on, when did it go to sea in the Pacific, the big float? Yeah, that's right. And I remember doing some reporting on it for BBC, and you just assume, well, I assumed at the time, we'd see loads more, all sort of, using that moment. But we haven't, and it's still, it still seems to be that seems to be holding the limelight better than other projects. So I expect that this sort of project leadership acts as a good beacon and a good example of what can be done to other people. We just maybe don't hear about it so much because people get. Sometimes journalists are lazy. We have an ocean story. Oh, what was that one that we did last month? Yeah, and they replay it. and people get it, and then they realise that perhaps your colleagues are great interviewees on the subject and make a phone call, and it's a nice, easy piece of journalism. But once something gets the public's imagination and the media's imagination, it sticks, doesn't it? You know. So I think there is a huge amount of technological advances and leadership and innovations and fabulous ideas coming internationally for ocean sustainability. But it brings the point that sometimes we just don't hear about them. Seems crazy. Yeah.
Good.
I would probably, I think very much the same. I think that it is an incredible example of how one person can make a difference.
Yes.
So that case of Boylan in the Netherlands, of that come up with the idea of recovering plastic from the surface of the Pacific Ocean. And by the way, I think that the testing now is going on in San Francisco about this. So it's kicking off this project after, I think, more than 18 million fundraising. It's a great project. And I was very elliptic when I answered that the way to act is to vote to a shop or to buy and to post. But one person can really make a difference. It's amazing. This is a clear case of that. I think that in a way, nowadays, I'm very also optimistic in relation to new generations, I have to say, because when you look into millennials, they are very different already from my generation. My generation is the worst of all generations. But absolutely, you know, I grew up in the 80s and graduated in the beginning of the 90s. And at my generation's time, the paradigm for a youth, a younger in Europe, would be to become a yuppie.
Yes.
Yuppie.
Yuppie would be a rich banker and accumulate money and have a very successful career. Huh? Yeah. Remember London?
Certainly do.
1990, yuppie.
Yes.
And everyone wanted to do that. So no one had any goals or any visions or any ideals, but to get rich. And I think that we did that in our generation. Not get rich, but not having ideals. And we contributed a lot because we knew already of the problem. Contrary probably to the previous generation, we knew and we did nothing. And we did nothing. Your generation is different because I think that you already feel that you need to do something because this is going to be your upbringing and the future. And so that's why I think that the relationship with nature that your generation has is very different from ours. That's much more people are vegetarian because they respect nature. They respect themselves, but they also respect nature. They respect animals. They think that they should do different. And I think that is even an instinct of survival that we have in our genetic code as a species that will make this change. But one thing is clear, we will completely change our relationship with nature during this century. We will fundamentally understand that we are not above nature and that we'll be part of it. That we are not the homo deus of Hariri book, as we spoke.
Yes.
Because we'll start suffering the consequences. We are already doing that. And that is true for the Netherlands and sea level rising or for Nepal and glacier melting. Not going to be different because we have affected the whole system of land by now. And so it's not different. You don't have safe havens, I'm afraid. There are places that are more severely hit than others, but you don't have safe havens. So action is to be carried out throughout the planet.
Right.
Yeah, yesterday when we were talking about this, and I think that the key word was, I think it was you who said it, it's humble.
Yes.
We need to be humble. We need to stop being so arrogant and looking at nature as something that we command and can exhaust at all times. We need to be humble.
But you know, we have a fundamental cultural problem to do that.
Yes.
Because all our existence since at least 6,000 years ago, 60,000 years ago, is a fight, a struggle against nature.
Yes.
We were very small. 60,000 years ago, we were less than 1 million people in the planet. So it was the opposite of what I said. When I said we ate the planet, it's because we are 7 billion. When we were 1 million, nature was overwhelming. That's why we still think that nature is for free, because at that time, it was so overwhelming, it was endless. We could not do anything that would possibly impact on nature. So it was for free. The problem is that in our mind, nature is still an enemy to a point. Cold, heat, rain, wind, animals. And at the same time, we look at it as something that is still as meaningless as this glass of water. If you look into our legal systems and the way we consider nature in our legal systems, nature in the civil law legal system of Europe is considered a thing.
Yes.
Article 202 of the Portuguese Civil Code. So nature is not considered a value. It's considered a thing. It's not considered an asset. Also for a traditional economist, nature doesn't value anything. What it values is our manufactured products. So you see the long way that you'll have to go culturally to be stripped of this humbleness, to be stripped of this arrogance. It's going to be a long, long way.
Okay. I think we have time for one more question. There was a lady there, somewhere there, that I think has given up. You have given up? No more questions?
No people with other views?
Yes, thank you.
Hi, my name is Katerina. I'm a student. My question is, we've been talking about the younger generations, but as Tiago said, the younger generations are more prone to awareness in the recent years. But how do we, as a younger generation, approach the older generation?
The more experienced generation will get better feedback.
Who isn't as educated in this matter? I don't mean the ones who are, as she said, sitting at the table, but for example, the fishermen and, for example, our parents and our grandparents who don't seem to understand what is happening to our planet.
Thank you. Thank you for your question.
Great.
Paul, this one is definitely for you.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I think, again, it's, as I said earlier, it's about getting out there yourself and having, meaningful experiences to gather your opinion as to what's going on. So let's just say it's climate change or it's overfishing or, loss of habitat. You need to be out there and have seen it for yourself, because I find it much easier when I'm reviewing a grant application for an expedition, if that person really has been there and knows it and does it. That carries a lot more weight and influence and respect from my team if we go, wow, she's been there, she's studied it, she lives it, she knows it, than perhaps someone who comes in with, on the face of it, a more beautiful application and even showing up with a designer suit and all these other things, and this person's an expert at going for grants. But we realise that this person has got all their knowledge from the internet or academic study. And all of a sudden, we lose interest.
Yeah.
So when you are trying to influence, parents, fishermen, other people who have done this for many, many years, maybe even for generations, one has to be very careful how we approach. And the safe ground is that when I was 6, I was swimming here and seeing loads of fish. Now I'm 30 and I'm not seeing anything and I'm seeing stacks of plastic. So what's going on? What can we do about it? That's a much safer, more effective ground than, I've just got this off the internet, look what's happening around the world. So that sort of guidance, yeah.
Great. I have 2 more questions. Yes, ladies first.
Great, yes, of course.
I'm very enthusiastic. My name is Catalina. I've been working at the same time of Tiago in the United Nations. I was involved in the negotiation of Agenda 21, and by chance, I was on the chapter Oceans.
17.
At that time, I did not know anything about oceans or what is represented. So I know that I love ocean, as Tiago knows very well. But knowledge about oceans I did not have. But at that time happened that I understood how important it was and how the countries
could manage in their interest the oceans. And the result is maybe not the most interesting one, but at least open the door and open the window for what we are speaking here. I have just another, not question, I'm sorry, I don't ask question because I'm ignorant, but
No.
I just say to the young people that have been speaking, just one word. They have something to do, is maybe changing the culture that they have been learning along with their parents, and instead to stay too much time in front of a TV or in front of a computer looking for some games, maybe they can see movies on oceans and what is represented, and see some experience of people like Paul, and understand what they can do from there on. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Last question, please. There.
Kiki.
Great.
Fernando.
Good day. My name is Fernando Jorge Cardoso. I teach, and I also work at the Lisbon Club, and I was also working on the organization of this event. I have one point before putting the point. Tiago, if we could rename the title of this Lisbon Talk, I would pick your words, and I would call it "The Nature is Voting," because it is. Or, taking up from Raquel, the referee is showing a red card.
He knows I love football.
Having said that, my point is that we have received 155 registrations of people interested to come to this event, and I have made the statistics of the kind of people that registered. Some of them are not here because the traffic in Lisbon
It's chaotic. Yeah.
It's not a lack of interest, I believe. At least I'm optimist also, I believe. But looking at that most were students, and the list were people from media. Two. I don't know whether they are here. Within the Lisbon Club, we have 100 members. We have 1,000 journalists. I don't know whether some of my club member journalist is here. What I want to say is not to blame the journalists. What I want to say is that the span of time that we have before nature is more disrupted cannot wait for the next generation in power. It has to be yours, probably mine, generation that is in power now, that has really to change behavior. And the media has a very important point and task in this. Because when we read in Portugal, newspapers listen to the radio and see TV, usually what is there are, of course, diversion. But when we listen about news, the news are about petty political struggles, crimes, and domestic sins, and a little of violence and sex sometimes. Global challenges, those challenges that affect us, are not present in the media. So my point is, for all of us, younger and less younger, okay, is that we do not have time to they have to be those that are there. And our point is that, I pick up what you said, really what we have is to vote and to boo. Okay? This is not really a question, but was something that I felt compelled to say. And just a little joke. You said, ladies first. Coming from Africa, we usually say, ladies first, but men before.
And I could go on about commenting on the situation in Africa, but I will not do that. Now, I think we have these really two great comments. I don't know if you have something to say that you would like to say.
On the media, for sure. I mean, you know, I work in the media, and you're absolutely right. We have a lot to answer for on this. And I sometimes jump out of my skin where on page 5 of a newspaper, it says there's water on Mars.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, and you go, why is that on, and it's this big on page 5. And on page 2, it's some horrible soap opera, television news or something. So yes, I agree with the media. I think we can do a lot better the way we manage our affairs in the media, absolutely. But thanks for your comments, thank you.
I wanted to make a final comment, and it's very much about also for the younger crowd that is attending this. It's for all, but I think that there has been a lot of questions from you about what can we do, how can we act, and I don't think that it is for me to tell you how you should act, because you act on even different ways that my generation did. Absolutely. So I won't be able to give you a good advice, but I think that you will understand. It's going to be an intuition that will come to you, and you will act as you think that is fit, and you'll find out that very well. I think that important to understand is that there is a process, and first we need the information. That's why we need the media, because without information there is no awareness. But with information, we might become aware, but aware is not enough. And I think that at this moment in our societies, even in Europe, we are at the level of awareness. But you need to move from awareness to conscience. And conscience is another step forward. It's when you are conscient that then you are able to be mobilized to causes. Yeah. And mobilized is not enough, because mobilized has to end up with action. So there are processes here and steps, but I think that, as you said, Fernando, the younger generation will not be able to wait for the older one to keep doing business as usual, and they will act because it's on their interests. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
Good.
Thank
now,
you.
Before we end, I'm going to take some liberty, and some liberties here. I would like to end this wonderful debate with two world-class experts on these matters. Really, I was so happy when at the board I was chosen to moderate this debate. You wouldn't believe it. I want to end with a quotation from the Green Book that Tiago has put in his essay.
Blue Book? Oh no, Green Book.
The Green Book.
The Green of the European Commission.
And it was for me something absolutely, I was dumbfounded that you could find almost poetry in something written by the European Commission. Okay? So I hope I do it justice. The European citizens have grown with the stories of the great explorers that have enabled us to understand that the earth is round, and that have taught us to know the exact location of the continents. Many of them enjoy their holidays by the seaside, in the midst of the busy fishing ports, tasting seafood in restaurants, and spending by the seaside their walks, avoiding the splash of the waves. Some spend their hours observing the colonies of sea birds or the whales, or waiting for the fish to bite. Others spend their free times restoring or navigating in old boats made of wood. This is my husband's dream. Others still like to watch the documentaries about the dolphins or the penguins in television or in the movies. Some will work in all these activities. Others will be fishermen. Others will be port captains. Others will work in tourism in all these seaside cities. But how many of them actually are aware and conscious that all these activities are interconnected? How many have the conscience that they are citizens of a Europe that has a sea? Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
Devia ser mais ao ponto agora, Raquel.
Thank you, Raquel. That was so good, yeah.
Oops, I hope you
Thank you, buddy. Loads of fun.
Yeah. Great.
It's really great.